I never thought that he would be elected president. I thought he would get the Republican nomination, but he violated and broke every rule in politics. I mean, he insulted every special interest group, the handicapped, the Hispanics. I mean, you can John McCain. You could just go down the line. And every time one of those things happened, I thought he'll never get past that, but he always did. It was a change election, and I think a lot of people, they just didn't like the way things were going. They didn't particularly like Hillary Clinton, and they just decided to take a flyer on the new guy, and that's what they did.
And in some ways, they particularly didn't like the press.
No, I mean, and you know, they distrusted us. They thought we were part of this Washington establishment, that we didn't understand them either. And to a certain extent, maybe in some cases they were right. I mean, I think we needed to spend more time. Our polling was not all that great, but we get carried away with this polling and all these new techniques and stuff. But Peter Hart, who's the dean of American pollsters, said to me, "You can do a lot of things with these new techniques that we have, but you can't know what's in a person's heart." And I think we've got to find a better way to do that. And I think that'll be more focus groups. I think because we have so few newspapers now that have enough staff to do it. It used to be the local newspapers, their reporters would go out and just knock on doors and conduct their own on-the-ground polling, as it were. And I think they got a better feel for what people were thinking about and what really mattered to them than some of these polls that we conduct now.
So with all of the information that's out there, it sounds like what you're saying is there's a lot of information, but much of it not vetted. And I guess my question to you is, are we better off because of all the information that's out there now? Or, as you ask in the book, are we simply overwhelmed by the information with no context?
We have so much information, we simply can't process it. And because with the rise of social media, with the decline of newspapers and the traditional sources of news, many people, the news they get on their Facebook feed, and that's fine. It's a great way to keep up with your neighbors and all that sort of thing. But you have to remember, that has not been vetted in the way news organizations vet things. In other words, we don't print or broadcast something unless we think it's true. Well, that's not always the case on social media. And we have to be aware of that because some of this stuff is not only wrong, it's wrong by design. We now know that the Russians were manipulating social media, putting these ads on there, using all this technology. Their aim was to trying to destroy the credibility of the media. And as Joe Nye over at Harvard says, and they got Trump as a bonus. They may not have been for Donald Trump, but they were for sowing discord and confusion and trying to raise questions about the information that people were getting. It's what they're doing all across Europe right now. It's their technique, and they did it with some success in this recent election.
Are you surprised, though, that the general public isn't more outraged by that?
I think it's people don't really have not thought about it. I mean, and why should they? I mean, people don't go into a donut shop to find out how you make donuts. They go in to buy the donuts because they like the way they taste. Well, a news consumer wants to know what the news is. They're not going to go into, well, how did they get that story and you know, the mechanics of how we go about gathering the news. And one of the things I tried to do in the book is introduce people to journalists and to newspaper editors and to television executives, and let them talk about how they go about their jobs and what they do. I think it's very important now for people to understand who journalists are and why we do what we do. I mean, we're not the opposition party, as Steve Bannon would have you believe. We're not people who are trying to run the government or impose our will on the voters. We're there to check the story that the politicians put out. They deliver a message. Our job is to check it and find out if it's true or false and what impact is it going to have on the governed. That's what the founders meant for us to do. That's our responsibility, and if we do it right, it's a crucial part of democracy. You can't have our kind of democracy unless people have information that's been independently gathered that they can compare to the government's version of events. If we do our job right, then they'll figure out what to do about it. But we have to give them that information.
So the president's challenging of the media, is that beneficial or is that dangerous?
Well, it's certainly not beneficial, and I think it is dangerous because it's undermining one of the foundations of democracy, and that is a free press. You can't have our kind of democracy without a free press, giving people information they're not getting from the government, or that they can compare to the news they're getting from the government. I mean, in a totalitarian society, the only source of news is the government. Well, nobody wants that. Nobody thinks that's a good thing for America, and so we have our role, and that is to present information that they can compare to the government's version of events.
But don't you think it's also true, and we can use the rancor in Washington, in Congress, as an example, there seems to be a resistance to even examining another point of view now. And part of what news and newspapers offers is an opportunity to bump up against different points of view.
Well, people, we're not going to be the most popular person in the room because sometimes we're going to tell people something that they don't want to hear. You know, in the old days, when Walter Cronkite was there, and we'd go to these affiliate conventions, and Walter, of course, always got the biggest round of applause, I mean, without question. But the person who got the second biggest round of applause was always Charles Kuralt. And we were all jealous of it, I mean, to be quite frank, and we'd rib him about it and tease him about it. And he'd say, boys, you got to remember one thing. All my stories have a happy ending. Yours don't. And so I've always tried to remember that. We're not always going to be the most popular person in the room, but our role is to tell people what has happened to the best of our ability. What we have to do is not let people try to paint us as some sort of group that's trying to be the opposition party. We're not that. That's not what we are at all. We're reporters.
Is it harder, though, to make that case when so often opinion is finding its way into news?
Well, it is, and you know, that's another thing with the rise of social media and all of these websites that don't follow the same guidelines that those of us in the mainstream legacy organizations follow. There has been a blending of opinion and facts, and opinion's fine. Analysis is absolutely essential, but it should be labeled as such. I mean, I did Face the Nation for 24 years. I did commentaries most of that time. But when I did the commentary, we always flashed a sign on the bottom of the screen, commentary. And that was because I insisted we do that. And I thought it helped, you know, with my own credibility. And people need to know that. He's giving his analysis now. He's not giving the straight facts. We did that in the top half of the broadcast. But I think that's very important.
What's a savvy news consumer to do?
Number one, the old rule, buyer beware. Recognize that there's good news sources and there are bad news sources out there. Go to the sources that you trust, and if you have questions about it, try something else. But always base your opinions on more than one source. I don't know anybody, even in our industry, that only goes to one source of news. I mean, I read 3 newspapers every day of my life. That's how I start my day. Then I turn on the television and watch the morning news. We all depend on multiple sources to form our opinions, and nobody can be well informed if they depend on only one source of news.
Kind of jumping back a little bit to politics, was the 2016 campaign also sort of a shot across the bow to candidates who insulated themselves from the media with handlers in a way that Donald Trump did not? Well,
I think that's what happened to Hillary Clinton. I think that was one of the strategic errors that her campaign made. She was running under the old rules, which is You know, you never put your candidate in a position where they might be asked a question they don't know the answer to. So she wasn't on the Sunday shows very much. She didn't do very many interviews, unrestricted interviews. He, on the other hand, was calling up every television program in America and saying, hey, you need me this morning? I'm available. And he just simply overwhelmed her with exposure. And it was not that we didn't push back. We did. But, you know, when we're pushing back on what he said yesterday, you know, he's already on to another topic tomorrow. And it went that way throughout the campaign. And when the Clinton people finally figured that out, it was simply too late. And
it continued after he took office with what you describe as the dead cat strategy.
Yeah. And the dead cat strategy is that
it's a very
if you're having a dinner party, no matter what you're talking about, and somebody throws a dead cat in the middle of the table, the conversation immediately shifts to the dead cat. And he did that over and over again in the campaign. I mean, the campaign would be about one thing, and then he'd throw another cat on the table, and suddenly everybody was talking about Trump and what he said. He had this. I've always contended he was not, in the traditional sense, a very good politician, but he had a very good understanding of how television works and the impact that it can have, and he exercised that very much to his advantage.
But with his show, he could always walk away from it. The show ends. He's in the White House now. Do you think he's enjoying this?
I don't think so. Maybe he is, but he doesn't appear to. I mean, he seems, in the kindest sense of the word, rather thin-skinned, I would think, for somebody in politics. He seems to take umbrage at the smallest slights. I mean, people say a lot worse things about me than they sometimes say about him. But I mean, you know, it's just part of what we do. You know, I'm sure somebody writes in and say, I don't like your haircut. You know, they certainly do about me. You know, I always tell a story. I got this irate letter from this person one time. It said I should never wear this watch on television because, you know, most people couldn't afford to buy a watch this expensive. Well, this watch is about 25 years old, and if memory serves, I paid $100 for it, you know.
So you've more than gotten your money's worth out of that.
I think I got my money's worth out of that. But there's always somebody that's going to take offense to something you say or do, or your looks, or, you know, whatever. And,
have you ever had a back and forth with him that was contentious?
I've interviewed him many times, starting way back when he made that ice rink function in Central Park after the government, the local government, couldn't figure out how to get the ice to freeze over. And it was a great story, you know. And then I interviewed him in the 2012 primary. And most of the time, the interviews I've had with him have been just fine. Very businesslike. And sometimes he seems to like me, and sometimes he doesn't. But, you know, I mean, we learn to live with that. I mean, there are worse things, and it's fine. So, I mean, I don't have any really personal problems with him. I do have some policy disagreements, obviously.
If you had to look into your crystal ball, having covered now 14 presidential elections, what will define the next election?
You know, I really don't know, and that's a very good question. We know that Mr. Bannon is saying that he's going to run a primary opponent against all the Republican senators, with the exception of Ted Cruz, who are up for re-election this time around. I don't know what that portends, and I don't know how that's going to come out. But, you know, he says, as I understand it, that's what he said he's going to do. By the time we get to 2012, I have no idea what the politics in this country is going to look like. I mean, I think we're right now at rock bottom for both political parties. I think both of them are on the verge of coming apart. You know, you've got both parties now. You have fewer people identifying as a Republican or a Democrat in both parties, and the parties, because, and especially with the help of social media, can now raise so much money on their own. They don't really need the parties as much as they used to.
Could that be a good thing for voters?
It might be. I don't know. It depends on how it all breaks down, and what comes out of it. somehow or another, I'm guessing we'll have a strong third-party candidate in 2020. I don't know who that is, whether it'll be a liberal or a conservative. We may have more. But I think politics as we have known it, I think we're coming to the end of that.